Hello, I'm Kads and welcome to today's video. Guys, we need to talk about nerfing. Now first, let's get some disclaimers out of the way. This is not clickbait. The purpose of this video is not to advocate for any particular nerf for any champion, despite whatever my opinions might be on the champions we were going to be discussing today. We're going to try and be as objective as possible within reason, but there will obviously be some amount of bias because I'm an individual. I do have my own thoughts and opinions. And in the context of Raid, I am pure free to play for those who don't know, so have not spent any money on the game, but nonetheless I am very much in the end game, so there's going to be a little bit of bias from both of those perspectives as well. So the main thing I really want to talk about is what I consider to be a myth that nerfs equal bad. And this was somewhat reflected in a poll that I posted today. It's on my community tab if you still want to vote for it if you want to. But essentially I asked you guys, what do you think? What do you hear when you see the word nerf in the context of Raid? And over half of you, only 51 votes, small community here, but nonetheless, over half of you said when you hear nerfing a champion, you think they're going to be completely useless after the nerf, dumpster fire, kick to the can, side of the road, useless. And about a third of you said an overpowered champion will become more balanced. Now, once again, for some context on where I sit, I tend to fall in the option 2 here. I think that balancing or nerfing champions is necessary if things are getting out of whack. But nonetheless, you can see here that majority of people have the slippery slope fear, shall we say, that any nerf means that it's going to be terrible. The champion will not be usable after the fact. And I do have somewhat of an issue with that mindset, but I'll provide some reasons and context for that. So for clarity, my stance here is that I don't think nerfs are always going to be a bad thing. Sometimes I think they are a necessary, shall we call it, evil in terms of balancing the game. So we're going to take a trip down memory lane a little bit and talk about some of the legacy nerfs, because believe it or not, way back in the day, champion buffs and nerfs, just rebalancing in general, used to be very, very common. It's just become a lot less common in the more modern era as the game became more popular, a lot larger of a community, and thus a lot more feedback, as shall we say, negative feedback when it comes to nerfing champions. But way back in the day, they used to do it on a more regular basis for the sake of balancing the game. So the first one I want to bring up here is actually an old fusion, believe it or not, also featured in a Titan event, but it is Tormin the Cold. Now, Tormin was introduced as a fusion, like I mentioned, but he was introduced to kind of combat the speed meta that was prevalent way back in the day. It's kind of seeing a bit of a resurgence now, and Tormin is seeing resurgence because of that as well, but we digress a little bit here. So Tormin, of course, we all know him for his Wintry Wind passive, where he can basically freeze anyone who places buffs or has their turn meter filled. It can be very, very disruptive and very, very like round or fight ending if you just get your entire team frozen and the enemy team cuts in. Obviously, he has provokes and other things as well. And a lot of synergy with HP burn and freeze if you can stack it together. But the main thing I want to discuss here, I wasn't playing back then, but from what I've heard, like his passive used to be way more broken than it ever is right now. And even right now, it can, again, be pretty oppressive, but it used to be way worse, way worse, way worse. So like you could just get repeatedly frozen. You were just taken out of the fight, essentially, if you ever did anything that procced the freeze, and it was just out of control. And so they nerfed it. I think 2 or 3 times they nerfed him to where he currently sits. And guess what? He still works in the exact same way against speed teams. If you run your Arbiter against a Tormin, you're boosting turn meter and you're placing a buff, increased attack, you have 2 chances to proc his passive on every single champion on your team, and you're very, very likely to get frozen. So he was nerfed. In fairness, he was nerfed and he still functions in his core role, but they brought him back from the brink of overpowered to something that's more reasonable. And Tormin literally inspired an entire meta of using immunity gear on people's champions, immunity cleansers and stuff like that to counter him. And so he was, brought back in line a little bit from both sides. He was nerfed to bring down his oppressive nature, but also people came up with counters to him, namely immunity gear and immunity cleansers, namely to deal with him such that you can handle the Torment on defense. It wasn't just a game or an arena fight ender. Continuing on with the legacy nerfs, we have to talk about one of the most powerful couples in the game. And a note here that we're talking about still one of the most powerful couples in the game. Main thing to keep in mind. So Sify the Lost Bride, what? She was nerfed? Yes, way back in the day. Believe it or not, this ability here, the block debuffs, increased defense, turn meter fill, increased speed, it used to be on a 3-turn cooldown when booked. They nerfed it to a 4-turn cooldown. Why? Because she would just completely lap your champions repeatedly. The buffs would stay up basically all the time, and you'd never get a turn. Of course, she's infamous for her A1 to lock people out, and so they thought it was a little bit too powerful. She was getting too many cycles of returns, lapping you repeatedly. She still does that anyways, even when it's on a 4-turn cooldown. But again, show an example of a nerf to a champion who was a little bit too powerful. They nerfed her abilities a little bit, and she's still one of the most picked and used champions in the game in the arena context. So she was nerfed, and she's still useful. Rotos the Lost Groom, another previous fusion. Yes, he was nerfed, and he was absolutely destructively broken when he came out. Everyone knows, the A3 here can ignore basically all of your defense if you get a Helm Smasher proc and Savage, etc. But this used to instantly block revive from the jump. Now you have to get your max HP to the maximum using the A2s. You have to use it 2 to 3 to 4 times depending on the max HP of your enemies. And once it's maxed out, then the A3 can start blocking revive. But again, initially he could just go in A3, block revive, instant turn or extra turn. It was disgusting. And so again, they nerfed him. But Rotos is still one of the most powerful single target nukers in the game despite being nerfed. So again, reinforcing the point that a nerf can just bring something from the brink of overpowered to something that is more balanced, but still overly useful. But I do understand you could say, hey, these were way, 2, 3, 4 years ago, and it's kind of a different level, or Plarium has a different stance on nerfing champions. So let's talk about things that have been a bit more recent. Again, I'm going to try and be as objective as possible here when we're talking about relative terms about, overpoweredness versus balanced versus etc. So a grain of salt there with these terms, but nonetheless, we're going to try to be as objective as possible. So the other one I wanted to, another one I wanted to talk about, who was actually nerfed before he was added to the game because of shenanigans that people were seeing on the test server, was actually Giscard the Sigiled. Now, this was a very unpopular time, or unpopular nerf at the time, even though he was absolutely busted. And so it was the synergy, or the super synergy, shall we say, of his A2 ability and the A3 passive. I don't remember it exactly verbatim, but I believe this ability booked down to a 2-turn cooldown. So it was a AoE provoke, 75% chance to land on a 2-turn cooldown when booked before the nerf. And then the way his passive worked was, I think it was it fills this champion's turn meter by 33% or something like that. Every time they're attacked, basically when they're under provoke that he would place. So what would happen was he would provoke everyone, and when you get to your turn, you attack him, you boost his turn meter, he cuts in as long as 3 out of the 4 people hit him, he cuts in, does some other ability, and then essentially he laps you guys, and he comes right back around to the A2 because it's on a 2-turn cooldown and re-provokes everyone. So you're stuck in a perpetual loop of provoking, which may remind you of a certain legendary that has been added to the game as a fusion recently, right? And if we're talking about perpetual loops of control. And so guess what? He was nerfed before he even came out. They reduced this to 15%, so he's not going to lap you just by being hit. And then, of course, this is on a 3-turn cooldown, so that he would have to take 2 turns in between to be able to provoke again, so it wasn't as busted. Again, an example of someone who was literally going to be game-breaking because you would be stuck in a perpetual loop of provoke, and you would never be able to escape because every time you hit him, he would literally cut in and get more turns than you, and they nerfed him to make him more balanced. Obviously, the community was outraged because they wanted the access to the overpowered champion who could literally lock down basically everything, but they decided at the time that that was too powerful, and so they nerfed it, and I agree. I happen to agree with that because that would have been overly oppressive. Now, of course, the elephant in the room concerning my snide comments here is, of course, referring to Armand's the Magnificent, who is basically the current iteration of this problem where you're perpetually stuck in a loop of control with the stun and him being able to basically get 2 turns, more or less, and reduce the cooldown. But even then, his ability is on a 3-turn cooldown, but it's effectively on a 2-turn cooldown if he's able to steal a turn meter from at least 2 enemies, more or less. So again, it's highlighting that that's a problem, and they, at least in the past, they addressed it. But in my opinion, Giscard, the Sigiled here, he's still very useful. I used him recently in the Cursed City. 75% chance to provoke AoE on an epic. It's good enough for what you need in most cases, and it's still very strong. And then, of course, he just gets less turn meter, but he still kind of gets some turn meter to help him cut in and cycle back to the provoke. So he's just not broken anymore, but he's still a solid champion. Now, the next one I wanted to talk about was definitely a very, very controversial nerf when it did happen, and that is Uragrim. Now, once again, this is another example, at least in my opinion, of a champion who was definitely overpowered, and they brought him back to a more reasonable power level. So Uragrim, really quickly, would go through his current kit. Attacks an enemy twice on the A1, has some chance of placing poisons. Single target cleanse that can heal them, and then AoE 2 poisons, and then 1 continuous heal on all allies for 2 turns. For a Void Epic, this is a very, very strong kit as it is. He places a lot of poisons, he provides a lot of support, a lot of healing, and also has a speed aura to boot. But if I pull up here on my other screen, what he used to do on the A1, it used to be a triple hitter, so you could have a chance to place 3 poisons on the A1, which is very strong. Obviously, Giant Slayer would be the choice there. And then the A3 that we talked about, instead of placing 2 AoE poisons, it placed 3 AoE poisons, big version, and then it also placed 2 continuous heals on all allies for 2 turns. 2 continuous heals. So that sounds a lot like a certain legendary champion. We can hop over to the Undead Hordes and look at Bad El Khazar, who I don't have, unfortunately. But essentially, he had this ability, but even better, because instead of placing 2 poisons, he placed 3 poisons, and then he placed 2 continuous heals. So yes, he didn't do the AoE cleanse, but effectively, you had an epic champion. Granted, he was Void, but you had an epic champion who was literally better than a legendary champion. Now, make of that what you will, but generally speaking, the whole point of the hierarchy of rarity in the game is that legendaries are meant to be superior to epics. At least that is how I interpret the hierarchy of rarity. That's not to say that one epic cannot have one niche that is better than most legendaries in that specific niche. Like Godseeker Neri comes to mind. She's one of the best revivers in the game. But the point of the hierarchy is that the legendary should be superior. So the fact that an epic could place more AoE poisons in the same way, not actually touching the enemies, 3 poisons versus 2, and he could heal the same amount, he was more powerful than Bad El Khazar, which just kind of breaks. There's no reason to use Bad El, essentially, if you have a Uragrim. And he was soloing Dragon and Ice Golem normal mode way back in the day, basically what Bad El used to do. And so now he's in a nerfed state, Uragrim we're talking about here. And technically speaking, he can still solo Dragon and he can still solo Ice Golem, especially now with Blessings and Awakening and Empowerment. Now it's even more easy to do. But, you had to run Regen and Immortal, but you could definitely do it. And it could be done back then. It was just a lot harder. The stat requirements are higher. But again, you don't necessarily need to solo anything. So it's kind of a weird state of affairs. But again, the point being, he was nerfed, and they brought him from overpowered, as in he was more powerful than his equivalent, shall we say, legendary, and they brought him back to where he should be as an epic, he should be a step down from Bad El Khazar. That's where he should be. He's an epic. Granted, he is Void, so he should be better than non-Voids, which he is. He's one of the best epic poisoners in the entire game, but he's not better than an equivalent legendary poisoner, and that's kind of how it should work in terms of rarities. But enough of the easier ones to tackle. Let's talk about the more controversial nerfs that happened in more recent days, starting with Emek Trunkard. Now, this is the one where, honestly, I got very, very confused by the backlash. So for those who don't remember, on the A1 here, that can grow shields on the ally with the lowest amount of HP, it would grow it by 25% of whatever it is. And essentially, as long as he would keep A1ing, it would grow to absolute infinity very, very quickly, because 1.25 multiplier is very exponential growth in terms of multiplicative nature. And so the increasing would stack to ridiculous heights, ridiculous infinite heights. And then obviously this was back then paired with Cadaver to do billions of damage against Hydra Clan boss and kind of breaking the game. And so they capped the shield growth to 10,000 HP. Now, the one thing to acknowledge here, and this will come into play later on when we talk about Wixwell, but when it comes to shield growth, and some other content creators have pointed this out, that basically, shield growing is only useful in longer fights, regardless of the value that it provides, because most champions have a buff that lasts for 2 turns on a 3-turn duration. Maybe with lasting gifts, it can last for 3 turns, but unless you're running an infinity comp, meaning you're pairing your shield champion or your shield growth champion with 3 buff extenders, and it has to be 3 because you have to match the duration of the cooldown of the ability to grow the shields. And so you have to have 3 buff extenders, in whatever form on the team. So the only context where growing shields even matters, because in all other contexts, it would just run off and it would go back. You would reset, it would go to 0, you place a new shield, and it would restart the process, and you wouldn't really do anything. The only context where it really applies is longer battles. So most bosses, Doom Tower, none of that stuff matters. It would only be clan bosses. And so the only application of utility, the utility of shield growth, is in Hydra Clan boss and Demon Lord Clan boss. So with that out of the way, what was the main gripe that people had with the nerf on the A1? Well, it was breaking the access of a, let's call it a more air quotes accessible team, which I disagree with, but it was a more accessible team, air quotes, in order to break into Hydra Clash and be able to be a little bit more competitive compared to the trended teams that are still taking over and have taken over and still run the entirety of the show. But again, if we're trying to be objective here, and some of the other content creators pointed out that they had some meeting with the raid devs, and so they kind of talked about this, or had a discussion about, should it really be practical, or is it practical to have infinite scaling shields in the game? And of course my answer to that would be no, it's not practical to have anything that scales to infinity. And so in this case, it's like, you know, did they nerf him too much? And so 10,000 HP, is that too low of a shield growth? Perhaps, maybe it could have been 20,000, it could have been, but the cap doesn't really matter, because again, the only application is in an infinity composition. And so outside of that, it doesn't matter what the value is, because the buff is going to just run its course and it's going to fall off, and it really won't matter whatever the growth is. Same thing would apply to Brogni. He only works in Demon Lord Clan boss if you have a bunch of buff extenders on the team in order to grow the shield to extreme heights. So once again, trying to be objective here, if we assume that an infinitely scaling shield is something that's probably shouldn't happen, it's probably a little busted, or dare I say overpowered, then bringing that back down to something reasonable is a good thing to do. And then from there on, you can debate whether or not this nerf to 10,000 of a cap on the A1 was too much or not. But specifically for Emic Trunkheart, I think this basically ignores his primary use case in the way he's used. Like, yes, that was one application of him to be able to power up a Cadaver team, which we're going to get to Cadaver in a second here. But primarily the way he's used now is basically a taunt champion. He's really good for Hydra in general, because as long as you have taunt up and you can reduce cooldowns with this ability here and synergize it with other cooldown reduction abilities, you can basically never get your champions devoured, because taunt prevents the consumption of your team, and then you're obviously unkillable, because he has unkillable as well. And so his primary use case is really the taunt and the unkillable, and then the AoE cooldown reductions. Like, that's his primary use case, at least now. And so really the A1 growth shield thing was something that was definitely busted, but it was more of a bonus thing of like, while he's placing all the shields from his passive and all the abilities, he can grow it a little bit whenever he counterattacks or when he does an A1. I think that's how they intended it to be, not for it to be some infinitely scaling damage machine to power up Cadaver. And since we've mentioned him a few times, let's go also talk about Corpulent Cadaver, who kind of received a similar treatment where his damage was capped. So of course it is focusing here on the A1, where before it just read that the additional damage, or he would attack one enemy and he would inflict additional damage if the champion is under a shield, and the additional damage was 30% of the value of the shield, and it did not used to have a damage cap of 200,000. So way back when, probably 2 years ago, he was featured in, I guess, the world record Demon Lord Clan boss team with like a Brogni and a Krisk and a Lanicus and some other Yumiko's and stuff like that to reset Brogni. But essentially, he would use your A1 as much as possible. You grow the shield as massive as you could with Brogni. You extend the buff so that it stays on forever, hence the term infinity. And then you would just have him A1 as well as joining in on ally attacks, and he would do millions of damage on his own, and the team would do like, I want to say like 1.8 billion or something, maybe 2 billion by the end of that whole iteration, or that whole era. And so he would do massive numbers, massive crushing of Demon Lords, record setting, record breaking, etc. And honestly, back then Plarium did not really have a problem with it, because as a lot of people have pointed out, and I do agree with the sentiment, that Demon Lord Clan boss is not a competitive environment. Once you get your one key, any more damage than that is definitely a bonus, so it's not really necessary to go past it. But if you want to, by all means, hey, push your account as far as you can go and see if you can get a world record if that's something you're interested in. But then people brought it over to Hydra Clash, and it started to dominate and take over, and they were doing billions upon billions of damage. damage, and then essentially you were skipping the mechanics of the heads because he would have a shield so massive that he would just one-shot every head as soon as it appeared, despite their damage reduction buff thing going on, and it was just getting ridiculous. And so they nerfed him and they capped the damage 200,000. It cannot exceed that. And of course the community was once again in an uproar because this broke the air quotes accessible option to break into high levels of Hydra Clash, although once again I disagree with that sentiment. Now the reason I disagree with the fact that people were saying that this was an accessible team for Hydra Clash is because it definitely depended on the fact that you had to basically have double Yumiko to keep resetting Brogni to grow the shield quickly, and then you'd have to use Cadaver as well as the Hex from Yumiko as well as just do the splash damage thing. But it relied heavily on double Yumiko in order to reset Brogni, so you could continuously grow the shield and grow it and grow it and grow it infinitely very, very quickly, and then keep A1 cycling with Corpulent Cadaver. But the one thing I want to talk about here is, as far as accessibility goes, one, you needed copies of a Void Legendary, and two, you had to do this entirely on manual. You could not do it on auto because Corpulent would go to the wrong heads at the wrong time, and so you had to always manual which head you wanted to attack, and this would take 2-3 hours. Okay, maybe not 3 hours, but it would take 2 hours full manual every single week for however many difficulties you wanted to do it on. So I know it sounds like an accessible team, and now there's more options for resetting of reset, so you could probably pull it off with a White Dryad Nia and an Emic and something else going on. But again, we're reinforcing the point here that accessible, sure, because there's a rare featured on the team, but you would have to commit to doing a 2-hour full manual run on whatever difficulty you wanted to pick every single week for every single Hydra Clash. And I just don't think that the average player, vocal minority aside, I don't think that the average player would really want to commit to that for the rest of their raid career. So that's where I draw the line and say that's not truly an accessible team, because you might want to do it once here and there, but you're not going to want to do it consistently for the rest of your raid career, trying to do that full manual runs. So again, I disagree with the premise of calling it accessible, just with the champions that you needed to pull it off and the gear you needed to pull it off more especially, and all those things combined. But the other premise that I wanted to address was the fact that people were saying that the Infinity Clan Boss team was dead for Demon Lord Clan Boss, which is true in terms of breaking the world records, but technically speaking, it was not true in terms of just being able to get the 1 key, which is what most people need anyways. You don't need to do a 1.8 billion damage on Demon Lord Clan Boss. You most certainly can, and unfortunately, yes, the access to that level, that caliber of team is no longer available, but if you really cared about nerfing him to the point where he could still manage to do a 1 key for Ultra Nightmare, he can most certainly still do that, even with a cap of 200,000 per hit, because that's still a pretty strong A1 for any nuker you might have built on your composition in Demon Lord Clan Boss. So a lot of nukers can put out 200 damage or 200,000 damage. And so one thing I wanted to pull up here is actually a video from Hell Hades where he did recently. Obviously, this is using Wixwell and Brogni, but the main thing I want to highlight here is that he was able to reach the turn limit cap here with an Infinity style team. Again, this is Wixwell with Brogni, so it's a little bit different. But I want to point out here that despite the nerf to Corpulent Cadaver, he still was able to, one, get a key up to 250 or 240 million damage, hitting the cap. And with Brogni, you could still hit the cap in an old school style Infinity Clan Boss team, because you could still grow. Brogni hasn't changed. You could still grow his shield to infinity and get all the way to the cap, unless you could still use Cadaver in that team composition. And you won't necessarily get, these exact numbers here, but the point being that getting all the way out there with the cap of 200,000 per hit, hitting the turn limit cap, he was still able to put out 75 million damage in this particular composition, which is still more than the 1 key for Ultra Nightmare, and that's just him, and that's not even accounting for any of the damage for anyone else on the team. So if we scale it back to the old school traditional, or the old school Infinity composition with, had a Brogni and a Krisk and a Lanicus, he could probably still do hundreds of millions of damage on that team, even with the cap, because you're getting the ally attacks from Lanicus. You're running at 2-to-1 speed ratio, so you're going to get 2 A1s for every single cycle or every ability that the clan boss uses. And so it's not dead in terms of being able to 1 key for Ultra Nightmare. It's just not as broken as it was in order to reach, multi-billion levels of damage. The last champion I wanted to talk about for this particular section is Madman, who was let's call him baby Trunda, so to speak. So on the A1 here, he did have a 50% chance of spreading damage, splashing damage like Trunda does, and then it was 30% of the initial hit, and they nerfed it to the point where the second hit is now normal, it's not critical. And so technically speaking, he can still do what like a Sun Wukong does, because Sun Wukong's splash damage cannot crit and stuff like that. So he can still put out a significant amount of damage, but obviously when you don't have the crit damage, crit rate, and all those extra multipliers, it just won't do as much damage compared to Trunda, who is allowed to crit. We'll get to her later, but she is allowed to crit, so she can just out damage anyone else, and that's currently how she works in the game. So this was of course very controversial, because if you're gonna nerf Madman, then why don't you nerf Trunda? And trust me, I agree with you guys on that one. I've been pining for the Trunda nerf for a while now, but again, I'm gonna try and not personally advocate for nerfs in this particular video. We're just gonna talk about what has happened in the past. And so yes, Madman was nerfed, and Trunda so far has not been nerfed. And in fairness, I think the discussions have led, at least from the CCs and the devs, that they're probably not going to nerf her at all. We'll get to that a bit later. But one thing I wanted to touch on here, again, same thing for cadaver teams, is that a lot of people were mad about this nerf to Madman, one relative to Trunda, and that she's allowed to continue on and that he's not, and that they felt that this was an accessible option for people to be able to do crazy levels of damage. And the one thing that I really want to point out there, once again, that accessible is a very like overused word in this context, because the main thing here is that it's a 50-50 chance. Yes, it's on an A1, and so technically speaking, you don't have to have a bunch of reset champions. You could just have them spam as A1. Compared to Trunda, again, the damage was not as much. It's like 30% instead of 60%, so it was substantially less. It could still scale up to ridiculous amounts, don't get me wrong, but there's also a 50-50 chance that he literally did nothing on the A1, whereas Trunda, you're guaranteed to get her effect every time you use the ability. So there's a bunch of RNG, which means that effectively you're going to have a lot of attempts and a lot of failed runs, because Trunda, again, is guaranteed every time she uses her A2, she's going to do the splash damage. You're going to get it. You're going to pop all the other heads whenever she uses that ability, and continue on with the cycle. With the Madman composition, you could literally be 30 turns in, get 3 normal hits in a row, not kill anything, and then you're basically going to wipe, because all your team is based on you setting up Madman to do damage. So you'd have to run the composition for who knows how many hours, multiple times, to get the god tier run where you'd finally break everything and just get it to work. And it's, again, for the average player, you're not going to want to do that full manual 1 to 2 hours per run with failed runs in there, because he just might not do it on the A1. I don't think most people, I could be wrong, correct me in the comments, but I don't think most people would want to commit to doing that every single week for every single Hydra Clash. And so I don't think this can really be termed as something that's accessible, or at least something that people would actively want to do consistently. So once again, yes, he was nerfed, he was very powerful, and he went from broken to basically useless. In this case, I will admit, he basically went to useless, but that's probably where he should be, my bias being acknowledged right there. But I think, again, he's just not as accessible, air quotes, as people made him out to be, because there was so much RNG in the full manual slog that would try to make it work, that it really isn't something that I think the average player would want to do. So all the champions I talked about here, the Tormund, the Siphi, the Rotos, all the more recent ones, the epics, the rares, etc. The point of highlighting all of those things was my thesis here that nerfs aren't always bad, and a lot of the time, or at least most of the time, it's bringing champions from the brink of overpowered to something that's more balanced. And a few exceptions to that rule, Madman being one, where they were taken from broken to benched, right, and useless. So yes, it can definitely happen, but again, my premise was that nerfs aren't always bad, meaning the champion won't always be useless. Tormund is still useful, Siphi is still useful, Rotos is still useful, Giscard, Uragram, Emic is still useful. They're all still used. Cadaver and Madman are the ones that aren't used, but like I explained, Cadaver could technically still be used in his old form. He just won't do billions of damage, he will just do tens or hundreds of millions of damage, which is still enough to 1-key Ultra Nightmare. So with all of that out of the way, I do want to end things on a different note entirely, and let's talk a little bit about what I'm calling the unnerfed champion. So this is your Yumiko, which is a proxy for just being able to reset champions, which is I think, more of the issue when it comes to that genre of champions, or that mix of champions. Of course, Trunda's in the mix here, and then more recently, of course, Wixwell with his infinitely scaling shields, akin to what Emic used to be able to do. And one of the most common themes that we see across all of the CCs on their channels whenever this topic comes up is that the community is divided, and it most certainly is, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, and what I'm going to call the community silo theory. And this kind of explains why Plarium doesn't want to act on these necessarily on nerfing champions. So as I explained a while ago, that Plarium used to do a lot of more rebalancing, including buffs and nerfs, especially nerfs, way back in the day when the community was a lot less vocal, and let's just say a lot less smaller, and thus a lot less vocal. But in more recent times, the player base has grown, the community has grown, and thus more voices have risen to the top. And so the community silo theory is that essentially there are a vocal minority of people that really don't like nerfs for the champions they happen to have, or whatever bias they might have towards that champion, or bias they have in general, myself included. I have my own biases here. I'm not immune. But essentially what happens is that every time we talk about a nerf, the people in that particular silo, so the anti-Trunda nerf camp, they'll rise up and say, don't nerf Trunda. And so they don't nerf Trunda. And then they'll say, all right, don't nerf Wixwell. So they don't nerf Wixwell. Don't nerf Armands, because essentially every single time some segment of that community, that silo of the community, comes up and says, don't do it, even though that's not necessarily representative of the entire or even the majority of the community. Because you guys have to understand that those of us who actually consume YouTube content, as I think Hell Hades and company have pointed out, we're probably about 10 to 20% of the entire player base of the game who are actually, I don't want to say care enough, but for lack of a better word, we care enough to actually consume or want to seek out YouTube content and have interactions with content creators and go back and forth and have these debates about all of these things. So we're already a minority of the player base in general who even watch videos and have opinions and polls and other things that we get feedback, or that Plarium can get some feedback on forums, etc. And so essentially every time we talk about nerfs, they get bombarded with a bunch of negative messages, negative press, negative whatever sentiment, and so they don't feel like they want to do it because they don't want to take the backlash, even though, as we've discussed, sometimes nerfs are better for the game. They balance things out that are definitely broken, and it improves things for the better. And so here, I'm not really providing a solution per se, but I just want to bring a level of awareness to the overall macrocosm of the situation going on right now. And that's part of the reason why we're in this perpetual loop of potentially OP champions being released and then not getting balanced because there's a bunch of community outrage. And you even have people that are like pitting their own silo against another silo. So they'll say, hey, well, don't nerf Wixwell because you haven't nerfed Trunda yet. And so you have the anti-Trunda nerf people fighting against the anti-nerf Wixwell people. So it's like, you know, there's so much division going on right now, even though at the end of the day, I would hope that we all want just to have fun in the game and to have it be an enjoyable experience. And so all of this kind of culminates into the crux of the video when we have to talk about Hydra Clash, which is the primary mechanism for a lot of the frustration that is manifesting from all of these relatively recent champion additions, or just recent findings or discoveries of how to exploit certain champion mechanics. Obviously, Armands does not really fall into the scope of this because he's more PvP, and that's a different discussion for a different day. But with Wixwell coming into the game and having the potential to scale to infinite levels of shield, we have found that it works with the Yannicka because she can remove a bunch of shields and then do a bunch of damage based on the value of the shield, and she can do billions of damage. Not Trunda level, but still billions of damage. Same thing with Ironclad and I think Aislinn, the Stalwart, who can rip off shields, and he provides a big heal, and you use Ironclad's passive to heal whenever, to deal damage whenever he's healed, proportional to the amount of surplus heal if he's full HP. So again, doing billions of damage. A lot of setup, in fairness to acknowledge, a lot of setup, a lot of prep to make those teams work, but nonetheless, it can most certainly work, and it can do some damage. Is that the right thing for the game? Perhaps so, perhaps not. But at this point, I think the solution relative to the Hydra Clash goes beyond fixing the champions at this point. I would still personally prefer that a lot of the champions that I mentioned here in the unnerfed category would get nerfed, because I do think it's better just for balancing the game. Wixwell, Trunda, Yumiko, etc. But in the absence of that, I really think the problem lies with the competitive nature of Hydra Clash. And I think Nubkex kind of said it the best in his video, where essentially you're forcing people to use the cheesy strats or the Trunda teams if you want to be competitive, because it eclipses everything else, and thus you're forced to do those things if you really want to compete, if you want to get your rewards. Which is not to say that there's not a place for those level of teams. It is cool to see how much much damage trended teams can do. It's cool to see how much non-trended teams can do. But when it comes to a competitive nature, the only option in terms of being competitive is the higher damage output team. And so at this point, again, I think we're beyond fixing all of the champions, because there's a laundry list of champions you're going to have to fix, especially with how they've been adding more and more broken things to the game. And so I think relative to Hydra Clash, essentially what you have to do at this point is, one, just give rewards for 4th and 5th. I think it's time to consider that option. That way it's like, hey, if you get smoked by some guy who did 90 billion damage on Nightmare, so be it. You're still 5th or 4th and you still get rewards. Who cares if you lose? I think it should be closer to the way CVC works, where as long as you do some effort, if it's a blowout, fine, you don't get any accessories. But as long as you do some effort, if you put in 2 billion, like this clan here at the bottom relative to the 10 billion team at the top, fine, you still get something because you put in some points. You get, one or two accessories instead of 5 or something. Something just for participating, just to make it worth it. Because otherwise it's like, why on earth would this clan even bother? They've only used 24 keys. Unless they know they can beat 7 billion from 2 billion, there's no point even trying, which is kind of just, it's a bad game design, bad competition design. So at the very least, I would just start by adding rewards for 4th and 5th. That way it's a little less painful to be beaten by some high tier clan or whatever, or high tier person doing a broken composition. That way you can at least walk away with some rewards. And again, like, I'm drawing a parallel to CVC, because even if you lose personal rewards CVC, at the very least you still walk away with the guaranteed rewards just from getting points for your clan. Again, akin to just doing what you can do, and you get some rewards. You might not get all of the rewards, you might not get the peak of the rewards for winning, but you still get something because you participated, and that's worth it. Versus here, you basically get nothing for participating relative to Hydra Clash. Obviously you get the drops from doing whatever you did in Hydra. But more to the point of the champions we were talking about before, if you really wanted to combat the power level of certain compositions kind of dominating the meta, then you do have to have some sort of diminishing returns when it comes to the delegation of points in the Hydra Clash. Because the way it currently works is you get a 1-to-1 ratio on normal, 2-to-1 ratio, 3-to-1, etc., all the way up to 4-to-1 on Nightmare, relative to how much damage you do relative to your amount of points in the score. So if you're able to do multiple billions of damage on Nightmare, you multiply it by 4, you're going to do multiple billions of credit in Hydra Clash, which is absolutely bonkers. And so if you had some sort of diminishing returns model, I can't spit out exact numbers, but I think Hell Hades kind of described some sort of scheme where it's like, if you do above 100 million damage, it goes down to, instead of being multiplied by 4, now it's multiplied by 2. And then if you go above 1 billion damage, it's multiplied by 1. Obviously, that would still scale to some number. So, don't take my math here and run with it. But the point being is having some diminishing return model so that, yes, you can do 90 billion damage if you want to with Trunda, but you're not going to do that much more than a team that did 500 million or something, for example. Again, I don't know exactly what that mathematical scheme would look like, but something along those lines would basically disincentivize you from going super hard, because you're not getting much of a return for doing multiple billions of damage compared to just running a good team that does a couple 100 million or even a couple billion, I think is where the peak is for non-funded teams. So some sort of diminishing return model I think would be a good stride in terms of leaving the champions as they are, letting them function, and just nerfing their power level relative to the specifics of Hydra Clash. But I think on top of that, you still have to add rewards to 4th and 5th. I think that's a bigger issue, because it's not just the fact that one person can win the entirety of Hydra Clash, it's that one person can make you lose Hydra Clash and not get anything despite whatever amount of effort you put in. So combining those two, I think that would be the perfect solution, but picking one or the other would have some effect as far as balancing out this particular game mode. All right, so there you have it. Those are my thoughts on the current situation relative to nerfing champions in general and past nerfs as well. With my long rant over, I now turn it to you guys in the comment section. Let me know, am I completely out of line here? Am I completely wrong? Or do you have some semblance of agreement with some of my takes here in this particular instance? I do want to reiterate quickly that while I am in favor of nerfing some of these champions, I think, like I said, we're beyond that at this point relative to Hydra Clash. And I think that if you just apply fixes to Hydra Clash itself, a lot of the grievances will just go away, because either it's just not going to be worth it to run a trended team every single week at least and do billions of or tens of billions of damage, or you'll just get rewards for participating. So even if you lose, you still get something, and who cares what the top does. This is most certainly a different kind of video for my channel. I definitely try to err on the side of positivity, or neutral positivity as I like to call it. But nonetheless, I did want to weigh in, throw my 2 cents in on the subject of nerfing champions. So as always, if you did enjoy the video, then be sure to hit that like button down below. And of course, if you didn't enjoy the video, you disagree with me, feel free. You can hit the dislike button. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, I'm just expressing my opinions. I am not compelling you to agree with me, and nor can you compel me to agree with you. They are opinions at the end of the day. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.